Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be dissecting MVC. Primarily, first thing we're going to be looking at is the problem, like what kind of problem does it solve and how did it evolve to become MVC itself, and then we'll dissect the inner mechanisms of how MVC is actually built, okay, in order to understand it. We'll basically rebuild the whole thing. So I'm going to be using LinkPad, link is in the description, and the first thing that we want to start off with is just get an idea, like what does MVC solve? We have a view, we have some logic that we want to execute based on the action that somebody is taking on the view, and then the way we communicate between the controller and the action is the model. Okay, that's how we pass information around. And today primarily we're going to be looking at the ASP.NET Core version of MVC, where we have a backend, right? And how do we know which controller we want to resolve? Okay, that's the primary question. And which action do we want to execute without tightly coupling the view to the actual function? Okay, so let's go ahead and make a URI, because this is where we start off, right? We're gonna send some kind of information to the backend, and the backend should basically find out what action it's gonna execute, right? So new URI, we're gonna have an HTTP. I don't actually have a backend. This is just a way to find out how can we traverse the URL and what kind of things can we do. Okay, and then we're gonna go to home, index, easiest controller. Probably everybody who's watching this video made this controller. So then we're gonna go ahead, basically assume that we are hitting our local host, and just be tiny bit correct. And let's get the absolute path, and I'm gonna use the dump function. This is only for LinkPad. Okay, so some people have been asking me, where is the dump function? It's a LinkPad specific thing, which will let you basically output stuff to the results window here. So you can see the absolute path. We get the home and index. Now, what kind of things can we do without having MVC to basically know what logic are we executing, right? Well, if you've been programming for any amount of time, the first thing that you really can do is basically say, right, URI, we will take the absolute path, we will split it by the slash, we will dump this, let's see what we get. I'll delete this path. Right, so we get the first space, which is basically just the nothing in the like before the slash, right? So let's go ahead and do a skip here. We're just gonna skip one, so we end up with home and index. Okay, so here's where the convention can kick in. What you can actually do straight up is basically just say, right, if absolute URI absolute path starts with home slash index, then we can basically say execute some logic, right? So here we can go straight to the action, but the problem that you can see that I'm outlining here is we're using an if statement, right? So if we have more than one or two routes, we're gonna have an equivalent amount of if statements, and this is not scalable. It's like you're not logically determining what controller you need to use or what function you want to trigger. What you're doing here is you're manually mapping out every possible solution. All right, this is not what kind of programming is about. We want to logically determine stuff, okay? And this is basically the primary outline of the problem. We don't want to go into the pit of manually mapping out everything. We want to automatically resolve the controller and what we want to use. Okay, so I'm going to go to a different file, and basically here we're going to start working towards building a more abstract concept, right? I don't want to dwell too much in this space, because the fact that we already have to put an if statement for a specific route kind of already is going to indicate how complex and verbose this is going to get, okay? So how do we build MVC, right? So the primary thing to understand this, I don't think I mentioned this in the other videos like dependency injection and middleware videos, where basically the problem that we're solving is not a business logic problem, right? This problem is our problem. Our problem as programmers, right? This is a programming problem. We are trying to solve the problem of scalability, of not having to write these if statements, right? So the primary problem that we're solving is how we write code. And usually that will fall under the reflection category, okay, and expression trees. So if you want to change the style in which you write code, you usually use reflection and expression trees to accommodate that change. Okay. So here we don't want to create if statements. What we want to do is we just want to follow a convention and just map the route to the action. Okay, let's first create this action that we can hit. All right, public, and we will do something very familiar. All right, public class home controller, and this is something you see in ASP.NET Core all the time. And again, we will do public string index, and we're just gonna return hello world here. And if you watched my previous videos on reflection, first thing that we want to do is we want to be able to discover this controller. Okay, we want to find out anywhere in our program where do we have controllers. The way I like to discover my classes is I'll make something like an abstract class and let's call it controller, and we don't really need to put anything in there. This is purely for discoverability. Okay, so from this point on, you can try to go ahead and discover these classes yourself. If you don't know how to do this, you can go ahead and see what I do. So let's go ahead and get the type of controller. All right, so we need to get the assembly name somehow, and we can reuse this type of controller. So let's say controller type. And what we'll do is we'll go to controller type and we will go to assembly, and from assembly we can get types, right? So we have a class, we check what assembly it's in, and in this assembly we have everything that we've ever registered, right? So that's how we basically say, right, where are you located, and give me everything that's in there. Okay, and here we can go ahead and dump this. And at the moment we don't have too many things. We have like 3 classes. We have the user query, controller, and home controller. What we want to narrow it down is to this home controller. So we just want to extract the actual implementations of the controller. So here we can say things like select, and let's say we want to remove the user query and controller. And a way we can do this is say like, is it abstract? Make sure it's not abstract. Okay, and instead of select, let's actually do where. Right. Okay, so here we have eliminated the controller bit, the user query, and whatever this is seems to not be abstract. So here we want to say, right, we're getting things that are not abstract. Now, how about we get controllers, or rather classes? It doesn't matter what this home controller is named or whatever. What matters is, does it inherit from controller? And this is where we can say basically controller type. And I can never remember this function, but it's something like implements or is assignable from. That's the one. So is assignable from type of, and let me drop this to a new line so it's a little bit more visible. I'll remove this bit as well. Is assignable from type of home controller, right? So at this point, if we dump, we get all of the classes, and this is a silly mistake because I'm basically, for every type that we get from here, I'm basically saying, is it assignable from home controller? So this clause is going to return true for all of them. So what we actually want to do is we want to compare it to the type that we're extracting. Okay. So instead of this, let's go ahead and pass X, and if it makes it any easier, we can rename X to type. Okay, so type, is it abstract? Nope. Controller type, is it assignable from this type? C. Okay. So at this point, we have our home controllers, and generally, because an assembly scan is a very performant operation, we will need to sort of cache this or store this somehow, right? And this is an IEnumerable type, so let's go ahead and we can basically store this, right? Var controller types. Okay, so here we are. We basically have our controllers that we discover if we add more. So let's create a test controller, right? So we're pretty much at a point where we're extracting all of our controllers from the program that we have written them in. What are the next steps? The next steps is we want to be able to grab the function, okay? And since this is going to get a little bit too much for the main function here, I'm actually going to go ahead and extract this into its own class, right? So I will kind of grab all the logic relating to MVC and I'll stick it in one class to kind of make it a little bit more digestible. Container, and yeah, I'll name it MVC container. So in the constructor, what I will do is when we initialize MVC container, that's when we are going to load all the classes, and then we can reuse that, use the same container essentially. It can be a singleton sort of thing. You can see that we have an IEnumerable of types here, so let's go ahead and make that IEnumerable of type, and it's probably going to be better if it's a list, and let's call this controller types. Okay, and let's name this a new list of type and initialize this list, right? You can initialize it from the constructor, it doesn't matter that much. You can go ahead, grab all of this, and instead of initializing a variable here, just remove that, and that should assign to this bit here. And I'll remove the dump, and instead I will replace this with toList. Okay, so let's go ahead back to the MVC problem. I will just grab the URI from here and I'll paste it here. We will also go ahead and just create an instance of the container, so we just kind of know where to move next. Okay, new MVC container. So at this point, when we're going to create this container, we're going to have all of our controllers. Where do we move next? Well, the kind of logical step is that we have this container, whatever it does inside, what we really want to do is whatever happens, we want to resolve this URI to some kind of view or some kind of response from it. Okay, so because the container, when we resolve the URI, can return a string, it can return an int, it can return an object, right? So at this point we will have to return an object because it can be that flexible kind of thing. Okay, so public object resolve URI, and for now let's return null. How do we know which controller we want? All right, so let's go ahead and first of all get the controller. So var controller get controller. Okay, and the way that we resolve the controller is again through the URI, right? This is how we do it. This is the convention that we're gonna follow. How we name our controllers is basically going to map to this URL here. So let's go ahead and get the controller. So I'm gonna go ahead and public controller. We don't know exactly what controller it is, but it inherits from this abstract class controller, so we can go ahead and map it to that. And yeah, get controller. Again, we're going to be passing the URI here, and again, let's return null here for now. So get controller. How can we map the URI to the controller types? Let's go ahead and in this function, let's grab our controller types. We will dump them and let's see what we have. So for example, for the home controller, you can see it kind of says home controller there. So what we can do is try to find something, I don't know, this name. Okay, so this is why LinkPad is so nice sometimes. You can just visualize things a little bit different, right? So home controller, and if you remember how our URI started with a slash, which we could skip. So at this point, you kind of want to map your home controller to the home index. So let's do this. What I'm gonna do is step by step. I'm gonna select the name, so I can sort of have a little bit of a easier inspection on what I'm working with. And then I'm gonna use URI, and I'm gonna dump URI as well. And let's get the absolute path instead. Okay, so here we are. So what's the difference between /home and home controller? Well, a home is capital case, so when we compare, we can ignore case, and home starts with a slash. So what we could do is append the name with a slash, right? Why not? Go ahead, do this, and pass this variable here. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Now we have this part which can match with this part if we ignore case. So how about we go and do that? So we'll, instead of select, we will say where. We'll grab this name, and what we'll do is we'll take the absolute path, and we will say that it starts with the same bit here. Okay, and at the moment it's not going to match anything. Oh, let me remove this dump function here. It's not going to match anything because the case is it's case sensitive, right? So if we go to starts with, we open up the assemblies and basically we take a look at what is available. We can see a string comparison overload. So let's go ahead and use that overload. I'm going to drop this to a new line. And in here, we can go for string comparison, invariant culture, ignore case. Okay. And we still get 0 items. And that is okay because I basically messed up the positioning a little bit. What should have been here is this name, because the absolute URI path is, let's say, we'll dump this here. All right, so again, it's /home/index. And actually, no, that does make sense. What we want to do is we want to return or rather get rid of the controller here, okay? And maybe if I dump this instead, it will be a little bit more visible, right? So now what I want to do is I want to get rid of the controller bit. So place controller with nothing. Okay, so this is a very crude implementation, but nevertheless, this is just more of how it happens, the logical steps. You can make this very low level and perform it as well. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So at this point, we're getting our home controller. Let's go ahead and remove this stuff, run this, and the dump is happening here on the end. Let me format this a little bit. Maybe it's a little bit easier to see. And now what we can do, instead of the where, we can just say first or default, remove the dump, and grab our controller type right here. Let's drop this down here as well, and indent this a little bit. Okay. So not very readable, but more or less you can simplify this as well. The main part here is that we do have our controller type. So now what we can do is we can go ahead and activate it, right? So we're going to use the activator, and if I remove this, create instance, controller type, and we're going to pass null for the parameters. Again, if you watch the dependency injection bit, this is where we can use the dependency injection container to basically get a type. Because all we do is pass the type to it, okay? And that's pretty much it. And on the end here, because this is going to return an object, we just go ahead and cast it, okay? And this is pretty much it. What we can do now is grab our controller here and dump it, right? So we can just take a look at it, right? So simple home controller, we have an instance. We don't know exactly what controller it is. How do we find out what action we need to trigger? And that's rather the next logical step. We got the controller, we need to find the action, and now we would like to actually invoke the action and get the result. All right, so let's go ahead and get the action. So action, get action, and again we will need our URI and the controller. So let's go ahead, pass the controller that we have found and the URI again. And let's go ahead and make this function. Will it make it for me? It will. Nice. And this will rather be method info, as you will see it in a bit. I'm just putting it here preemptively, but same as always, I'm just going to return null here. I no longer need to dump this controller because, as you can see in the output window here, it's rather pretty simple. Okay, so once we are in the get action, how do we find out what methods our controller has? And if you guess it, it's reflection again, right? So let's go ahead, grab type of the controller right here, and we'll dump it just so we can take a look at what's in there. And probably not like this because that's a compile time. We'll rather say get type here and dump. All right, so we get the type. And by the way, you can do it as much as activating the instance later on here and actually passing the controller type to this function here, so you don't have to get type again. And this is just a performance thing. Okay, so let's take a look at what we have. What we're looking for are methods, right? So declared members, declared methods. Let's take a look at this list. Oh, look, there's our index method, right? Let's go ahead and just make a test function here as well. So let's go ahead and make test. We will run this again and we'll scroll down here just to understand that that is indeed what we're looking at, right? So declared methods, index test, again, we know we have the name, so this is how we can discover this stuff. Let's go ahead and get the methods. So we will try to search for declared methods. We only have declaring methods, so that's not gonna do. Next thing, we just search for a function, get members. It's nice that it's there. Okay, let's go ahead and run this. We can do extra things to sort of filter this list. As you can see, we have the constructor, get hashcode equals to string, whatever. But really, all we need really is a name, right? So let's go ahead and do something along the lines of URI absolute path again, so we know what we're working with. And for the members, for now, we will map this to select, and we will get the name, and we'll dump the name, right? So we can get a parallel of how do we actually want to work this out. And usually for the controller type and the action, how we basically get those things, or rather, yeah, get action and get controller, you don't use these if statements or these predicates in LINQ. What you really do is you use regular expressions and regular expression groups to extract those variables, okay? But that is a little, I think this is a little bit too advanced, and regex can introduce a lot of complexity into this example. So what we're doing is a simplistic example, okay? Just know that there are a lot of techniques that you can apply to make this solution more abstract and more flexible, okay? So again, we have the home and we have the index. Let's go ahead and just do a split by the slash. Okay, so all right, we have nothing, home and index. What we want to do then is just grab the last one, and we have index. And by the way, if you're remembering towards how real controllers work, how you can have default routes, how you has special handling, if you just go to home slash, again, that's just an implementation detail. It's a feature, it's not a solution to a problem, okay? We could implement that, but we won't. All right, so we have our action here. So let's go ahead and say grab action, and instead of select, we'll say again first or default, and let's drop this to a new line. Actually, what we will do here is we will use the equals comparer. We'll compare it to the action, and again we will use string comparison to compare to invariant ignore culture case. Okay, so now what we will have is hopefully a method info, and this is, I've noticed rather that it's member info because I get members. Let's see, get methods instead. Okay, the methods still have names. Okay, so let's drop this down to a new line a little bit, make it fit. We don't need this return here, and what we can do is let's just dump the action here, see what it looks like. And here it is. So runtime method, what we can do with the action is we can invoke it, so we actually trigger the function. And just to step over how we get the action again, we get the last thing in the URI. So again, we can go ahead and dump this, and because this is a URI, if we do put something like parameter here, let's call it message, we'll say hello. You can see that we still get index here because the absolute URI here, the query is not included in there, okay? So it is kind of safe, right? But not, again, you would use regex for this sort of thing. You wouldn't use such a concrete implementation such as a LINQ statement. But nevertheless, where are we? We know the controller that we want to execute. We know the action on that controller that we want to execute. What is left, right? Well, just executing the action on the controller. Okay, so let's go ahead and call the invoke function. We're going to put a controller in there as the first parameter, and then it's the actual parameters that go into the function, right? So the way to think about this statement is we have a method. We want to invoke this method. Where is this method present? On this object. Does it need any parameters? No. So invoke returns a nullable object. Let's go ahead and return here. And this is pretty much it, okay? What we want to do now is we just want to dump the result if it makes a little bit, I don't know, more, yeah, the word doesn't come to mind. I don't know what I wanted to say. we can dump the result, and here we have hello world. Again, if we want to go to test, we can go ahead and say go to test controller, and we will say test world, refresh test world. If we want to go to test, hello test, we will go and one home test, run this hello test. Okay, so now that you can see, we're not really in need of writing more code of these if statements if we want to handle more routes. Okay, we just write the thing with the logic. Okay, we don't need to create another if statement, and this is the problem that reflection solves, and this is the problem that MVC solves. Okay, it's a scalable solution. You only need to change one place in order to introduce a change. If we have to make two changes in basically creating an if statement and then creating some kind of logic handler, that's not scalable. Okay, scalability is one change in one place. Okay, so now for fun, we are going to take a look at maybe how to do some model binding, right? So let's say we want to pass this message here. And by the way, I'm just going to do really simple model binding. Model binding, as you know, can become very complex. You can do from query, from form, from body, from headers, from route, right? There are a lot of different ways. The model binding in ASP.NET Core is a lot more complex than what I'm going to show you here. But this is just a simple implementation, and again, it's just looking at how you can use a reflection to achieve these sort of things. Okay, so index, right? How do we know what parameters? Where do we even pass the parameters, right? So if we take a look at the resolve function, we have the null here. Okay, so let's get the parameters. If we take a look at the invoke function, or rather, if I hovered it there, I could see it. But essentially, the parameter that we want to pass is an object array. Okay, so let's go ahead and grab our parameters, which will be here. And the parameters we will be able to see on the action. So let's just dump the action here before we go anywhere. And the URI, yeah, the URI again. Where are the parameters going to be? In the URI. And what usually would happen is you replace the URI with the HTTP context, where you have information to all the things in the request, like cookies, headers. I mean, cookies are headers, body, form, etc. And then you perform that logic on the HTTP context rather than a simple URI. Again, this is a simplified solution. Let's go ahead and implement get parameters. We are going to be returning an object array. This is private, doesn't really matter, not a real project. Let's go ahead and return null. What we can do is just grab these parameters, put them here. It's gonna break, but we don't really mind that much. What we really mind is taking a look at the action. What do we actually have, and how can we take a look at the parameters that we need to supply? So I'm dumping it here. Let's go ahead and take a look at the runtime method. Anything that talks about what parameters we have, only the return parameter, nothing else seems to be mentioning parameters. Okay, so let's go ahead and remove the dump here, and what we can do, what you usually do if you can't find the properties on there, just take a look at what methods you got, right? So method info, let's just type in parameter or param or para, and you get the get parameters function. Let's go ahead and dump this, and we don't have any parameters because we're looking at this test function. So let's go back to the index page, and really what we can do, kind of safe handling, is let's say parameter types equals this, and parameters types dot count. Well, actually, let's call to list on here. Dot count. If it's 0, return null. Okay, we don't want any parameters in this, then this will work fine. So quick little safeguard that we could put there. Let me put the dump on the new part here, refresh this, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go back to the index page where we indeed do have parameters, and I can no longer invoke this with a null. So here we have our parameters. You can see that the name is message and the parameter type is string. So how do we want to approach this? So let me just actually I will stick with one parameter, and then we're gonna bump this up to 2 parameters, and we're gonna see at how this can behave and what just the general problem solving that you have to do in order to get this to work. So parameter types, let's instead rename these to parameter infos. Okay, since this is just parameter info and we got a bunch of parameters infos, because the way I'd like to map this parameter to the method is just to be aware, does it have the correct order sort of thing, okay? Because if we have more than one, it can get a little bit weird. But yeah, let's replace this with parameters infos so it compiles. Next thing, we want to take a look at the URI, and we want to take a look at the query part. So let's take a look at the URI, type in query, and we have query. Let's go ahead and dump this, and let's see what we're working with. Message hello. What we can now use is HTTP utility. Bring this in, and we can parse query string. And let's go ahead and pass our query into here. And let's put the query here, and we'll dump this. So again, we can get a better visual on this, okay? So now what we can do is we can do something along the lines of query, let's say message as the key, and we can dump this, and we will get hello, okay? And for the parameter infos, we can dump this, and where do we get the key from, right? The name is there. So again, what can happen is they can be different cases, so what you tend to do is you just ignore the case size, okay? Unless you don't want to do that, then I mean, the implementation detail is up to you. We want to be able to return an array of objects, and really what we can do is maybe yield enumerable, although I don't think that will be a good idea. Let's go ahead and create an object array that's going to be the results, and it's going to be a new object array, and the length is going to be as much parameters as we have. So let's go ahead, grab the count here. Put this here, semicolon. Let me rename this to var, and parameters infos, I don't need to dump that anymore. I know I can grab the name, I have the utility, and I know how I can grab the value that I want to bind, right? So let me actually keep this here. I'll put a value tag on this so we can see the collection and we can see the value that we want to work on. Let's create a for each loop. So now what we're going to do is we're going to loop through all the parameter informations that we have, and we're going to instantiate them one by one, okay? So var p info equals parameter infos, and not equals but rather in, and here we are. So this is probably a little bit better with a loop since we already created a result array, so we will need an index. So let's create this instead, and here what I will be doing is using parameter info count and I++. Cool. So here's our simple for loop. So how do we know how to bind the value? First thing that I want to do is grab the value, right? So var value equals query string, put it here, and here what we will do is we'll replace this with parameter. Oh, let's grab the info, parameter infos. We'll grab the first one, or rather the index one, and for the info we're going to just grab the name, right? And that was the key as we've seen it here. Let's go ahead and run this, and we still get the correct value right here. What we now want to do is we want to create an instance of the parameter. So what we do is we grab the type, same as how we create the instance for the controller. We need to know the type of the controller to create the instance, right? So again, parameter infos I dot, and we look for the type, get type, parameter type. There we go. If you get type on parameters infos, you're gonna get the type of parameter infos. So don't make that mistake. Grab the parameter type. Okay, so that's going to be the type class of the parameter that the parameter info describes. So we can go ahead and dump this, and we can just specify the type flag here so we have a better visual that it's a string. And here what I will opt in for is, again, not the best solution. I will go for if statements, and usually you would use something else like more complex mechanism. This is again just a simple implementation. We're gonna say type, and does this type equals type of string. Okay, and if it is, I can just go ahead and grab the results objects, and for whatever I can grab the value and I can toString it. So let's hover over the value and is it string? I don't think it will always be toString here, or at least I don't think so. No, it will be string, so we don't need to call toString on it. Yeah, let's see what happens, and in the end, let's go ahead and return the results actually right now. And there we go. Wherever this dump is happening, right here, don't want to really see it, and the dump of the type, don't want to see it as well. Go ahead, run this, and we get hello world in the end. So what next can we do to spice this up? Let's go ahead and add an integer, and we'll just try to bind it in different directions. So again, we'll do an and we'll do something like num5, and we will go to our function, and because we have message number, what I will do is I'll say number message. Okay, so int num and string, and let's actually output this because that could be fun. And put the message here, and then the num, and don't forget to wrap this. Okay, let's run this, and here we have hello and 0. So what has happened? We don't actually handle the binding of the integer type. So again, if we go on the parameter type and we dump this, we will see that it's integer 32 and string. So what we can do is add an if statement. So let's say else if type equals type of int32. What we do is we just say results and int32 parse the value. Okay, and now if we run this, we get hello 5. So this is pretty much it for the poor man's model binding and MVC. I don't think this solution is particularly hard for MVC, but again, as I've said, there are a lot of things that we have simplified, such as model binding, but the action discovery and controller discovery and loading and instantiation is pretty much the same, at least at the core of it. Okay, and hopefully you understand the concept. But yeah, this will be it for this tutorial. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, subscribe. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comment section. Don't forget to join the Discord channels. I do a lot of updates there. There's also a giveaway coming up. I also stream on Wednesdays and Sundays on Twitch. Link is in the description. Have a good day, and hopefully I'll see you in my other episodes.